Sorry.
When you are back.
Will do.
Got it. Hello, YouTube. Welcome to round 2. Oxford IV. How are you today? No, yeah, let me stop with it. But yeah, make sure to like and subscribe to Oxford IV or whatever the channel name is.
Right. My partner's back.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So we are good to go. Please, before you start, just tell us what's your POI preference and how do you like to take your POIs. Otherwise, we will not be putting timestamps in the chat because we are focusing on judging and not putting numbers. So just time yourselves. And that's pretty much it. Let's get hyped and let's invite the Prime Minister here.
Hello, can I be heard? Great. I'll take POIs in chat. Okay. People keep sending messages for no good reason. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We think this is principally legitimate and would be a tremendous thing for parents to do to improve the quality of child rearing and raising that children receive. Just contextually, we imagine this may be something like a mood alteration pill taken to some extreme, where it improves the conscientiousness that children feel, such that their mood is to always follow the rules or always follow what is socially acceptable. Some preemptions. First of all, for any abusive thing opposition says a parent might do, an abusive parent may still demand other things from their child and will still do things to coerce their child into that choice because they're abusive. They may enact violence, withhold affection and care, neglect them, guilt them into doing it, or just restricting their freedoms. So not only is this alternative worse, since the actual gravity of harm is more intense and more likely to not, have long-lasting effects on the kid, we also don't think they even get the benefit of reforming children. Second preemption. Op might say this is temporary, so has no effect. Broadly, we think you're more likely to exhibit this behavior in the long term because you get used to it. It becomes normalized and becomes a routine for you, which means that even if you weren't predisposed to going to school at first, you get used to it and you inculcate habits that let you do it even better or know how to do it in the first place. This pill serves as an important starting point when children are not good children and we can grow them into being better children. Thirdly, they might say rules are bad. Firstly, why should children be the ones to challenge these rules? Adults themselves have far more information and mental capacity to process and internalize these things. We think children often face many negative externalities when they do attempt to challenge these rules, like getting beat by their parents or getting bullied in school. We think that's a social battering ram that they shouldn't be used for, and moreover, they should still have the capacity to do it when they become adults anyway, so there's not much marginal change. The politeness pill also, in addition, probably doesn't deal with the rules that are very controversial. What is defined as socially acceptable likely falls most keenly on stuff that we safely and all agree we want to avoid kids to do. So maybe we might be less consensus on like a certain rule for children, like, I don't know, about sexual orientation, for example, but we are more guaranteed that we don't want children to be like, I don't know, doing drugs and so on, because that may damage their health for the long term. These preemptions prove that OP has to deal with the majority of instances where parents do have some genuine interest in their child, but may fail to be able to raise their child well, or their children are just faced by other exogenous instances or circumstances that we would like to shield them from. Having said that, argument number 1, autonomy. And note that this isn't a solely principled argument to prove that this is a morally obligatory choice to give parents, but it illustrates that for many children, this substantially improves the quality of parenting they receive. Why should parents have this option to force it on their children? First is that children already have very limited ability to do things for themselves. They have limited ability to pick what school they want to go to. They're not allowed absolute independence. And we think that in principle, big choices already are put in the hands of parents, because we recognize that in principle, the autonomy of a child is subordinated because their autonomy is not yet fully formed, and intellectually they don't have the capacity to think in the long term, think for the long-term ramifications of certain actions, or just even have a cost-benefit calculus for themselves outside of basic bare hedonism. The restriction of agency is good and even necessary, and the problem is that many smaller decisions necessary to aid in the formation of these larger decisions or otherwise build up the long-term behavior-forming processes and patterns cannot be considered and often not be controlled. Children that skip class, even if they are forced to go to school by their parents because they're driven there, can still do things like not pay attention in class or not be a good student or bully other students. And even when there is a degree of autonomy for the child that they can exercise, they impede on the autonomy of other children. Most social rules act and exist for a very good reason. It's not only does it harm you, it harms other people. When children act rebelliously, they also inhibit the autonomy of other kids. Kids who get peer pressure to do drugs, skip school, and get bullied, for example. Some kids want to do well, but they are surrounded by kids who either make it difficult for them to do so or make it impossible for them to do so. So the end of this first point is that children have very limited ability for this to do things for themselves. We think that should be extended to this particular point that is necessary to aid in the broader thing we think is a good thing. Secondly, we also don't think the parent will have a full authority of the child, but we think that the parent doesn't dictate every belief and action, but it's important to have a variety of influences for growth and a balance of influences. The problem is that many of these balances are never afforded them if the child is predisposed against following certain rules. Like if they really like the parent, then they will never listen to the teacher, for example, which is an authority problem that many kindergartens and nurseries face, right? So making sure that we are able to have the kid listen to the teacher, even if they don't like it, provides them a balance of authorities that is generally good for their upbringing. Thirdly, in many cases, it's also really hard to raise kids. Parents never know what their personality will be like. They often don't know the best teaching process. Many of them are extraordinarily stressed about having to take several jobs, or about having to raise their kids, or about their relationships, right? They're stressed about their children not obeying them. And in many cases, this may lead to abusive behavior even further, or at the very least neglectful or bad parenting. So this is a net harm that we're able to reduce because children never bring them to this brink in the first place. Moreover, additionally, we also think that it's easier for parents to raise children and give them a higher quality of standard of living and raising if they're less of their mental bandwidth is spent on trying to figure out if their kid will disobey, and more time focusing on what is the best way to actually raise their kid. As a principle, this option is morally obligatory, not only because it fends off potentially worse alternatives, but because it fits in neatly into what we think the duty of the parent should be. Moreover, it has several pragmatic influences on how generally good a child's life will be in several large ways, whether it be having them just have like more obedience to certain rules, having them be better prepared for work and life in the future, and so on. These are all things that we think are good and we'd be perfectly willing to defend. Secondly, though, we don't think that this just benefits all kids. This also benefits a specific group of vulnerable children that we think are likely to be specifically benefited by this. Children aren't just born rowdy or disobedient, but are often a consequence of social environments that end up compounding. Many children live in a troubled neighborhood and have trouble paying attention to school, are more likely to act out, to seek for attention, or because they disobey and distrust authority. They're likely to have compounding problems because they're already in a position of initial disprivilege and are looked at by teachers as a problem child, given less resources and have worsened educational outcomes. This is why structurally, even though we don't think there's a difference inherently between things like races, you're still likely to see things like generational inequalities when it comes to the actual IQ outcomes or the actual testing outcomes of many children, why many of them are disproportionately unlikely to go to college, why many immigrants, for example, are unlikely to finish college or unlikely to finish high school because they're given disprivilege from the very beginning. We are able to rectify many of this generational disprivilege, first of all, because the actual participation and value you generate from these educational institutions is higher. You're more likely to listen. I'd like to highlight nobody's raised a POI. You're more likely to listen, you're more likely to get actual value from these things, and you're more likely to learn the rules that gives you the capacity to perform in these institutions better. Secondly, you also remove a game theoretical problem, which is that many teachers preemptively distrust their students because they don't see them as capable of following rules or because they're already loaded with preconceptions. We fix many of these preconceptions because they trust the pill to be capable of keeping these kids in line, or at the very least exemplifying behavior that would make teachers trust these children and as such are more likely to give them better educational outcomes. So this is likely to substantially improve the educational performance of individuals, leading to generally large impacts when it comes to social mobility, when it comes to them being able to get things like good jobs and escape poverty or escape at least some cyclical form of discrimination and oppression. By and large, this is not just a good thing in the form of actually improving individuals' lives, but secondly, it also removes the game theoretic fear that we mentioned in the first argument, that other kids peer pressure other kids into doing things like skipping school, into doing things like doing drugs. But thirdly and lastly is that we also are substantially able to improve the quality of life within many of these communities overall, for the reason that we also likely improve the confidence that they have in the workforce and the labor force within these communities, bring in more businesses that allow for things like economic development, community development, to substantially improve the quality of life for these people. Note that these arguments aren't just arguments for the sake of it. These are gigantic impacts in the name of education in a society that may already have these pills. We want the capacity to have parents let these pills be a tool for good for the education, quality of life, and economic upliftment of these children. For these reasons, affirm.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now let's move on to the leader of the opposition. Here.
If everyone could do POIs however you're comfortable, I'll keep checking in the chat, but also just absolutely just go for it if you want to shout at me. Right, so I'd like to start quickly with some rebuttal of what we've just heard from our open government. So we've quickly had something about, let's talk about autonomy that they brought up. So it said that it improves the quality of parenting. I'll go on to this in my main point, but I really quickly want to address the problem right here, right now, is that we cannot simply allow parents to effectively have a scapegoat of how they can stop parenting well. It's effectively giving them an outlet of, they should be the ones that are responsible for their children. They can't be like, there's a disconnection by simply giving them a pill to get them to sort of act really well. It's giving the parents an out. Parenting is hard. If you're going to find it hard and you're not going to be able to look after your child well, that's a whole other issue here that, again, is going to actually be negatively impacted here. You should not be having a child. All that it's going to do is actually create a negative relationship with your child. Because the problem is that it's there, you're going to see that your parent relied on giving your child a pill all the time. And the problem is that even if, so that child that's had the pill for like all the way up until they're 18, because their parent thought it was a normal thing to do, they'll then give it to their own child. Even if they're like their own child isn't necessarily like badly behaved, it's become a norm for them. So the problem is it's going to continue on generationally, which actually disproves what you were saying about it's going to be better generationally overall. You also talked about other children, so the whole bullying thing. Thing is, often children that are bullying or acting out in this way are having issues themselves. They may even be having issues at home, and by their parent giving them pills that are giving them good manners, it's actually allowing for things such as domestic abuse or, again, mistreatment at home to be basically covered up. It's allowing the parents to effectively, again, have a scapegoat that means they can have their child quite happy and sort of living a normal life. But the thing is, they're actually suffering. This is allowing them, it's effectively saying to these children that are bullying and are acting out, because you're in pain and because you're acting out, you don't deserve to be human. You effectively just deserve to be a normal, this person that wanders along and looks like they have a perfect life and effectively is creating robots. You're also talking about, so you talked about abusive behavior. As I said, actually this could allow for the silencing of abusive behavior, because children, again, may feel like this is normal. It may just be a thing that's continued on constantly. I'll take the POI from David.
Yeah, so it's unclear to me that parents who would become lazy would stop being lazy and in fact just look for excuses to give lower quality like child reading to their children. At least they actually let the child learn some values as opposed to learning nothing.
Problem is that it isn't teaching them the only values it's teaching them is that parents basically have control over you, have complete control over you. Okay, you're going to have parents that are going to be lazy. That's always going to be the case. The problem is by giving them a pill, it's giving them an out. So whereas these children, again, could actually grow in their own ways, they could rebel in their own ways, which, as I'll go on to my main point, actually allows them to grow in different ways. All that you're doing is actually stagnating their mental development. You're not allowing them to rebel, which is a necessary part of being a child. Being a child, all of us have rebelled against our parents in some way, whether it's sneaking out late at night or, you know, doing something when we really realistically shouldn't. We're not going to be able to get rid of lazy parents, no, but this is not the solution. Again, what it's going to do is not going to help lazy parents, but it's going to help those relationships that are abusive. It's actually going to make those worse. It's only going to make that relationship worse, whereas by not giving the pills at all, okay, the world says it is, and that's better than what it is under this motion. So also you talk quickly about the social environments. Again, it's just going to be made worse because it's going to become normal. But you also talked about sort of like good jobs. But the problem is that actually this is making controlling relationships a normality for people. So again, this is kind of go into my main point, but I'll just quickly give the sort of lead of analysis here. So if a controlling relationship becomes a norm for a child, so say again, it would be a minority, but there'd still be children that very much their parents gave them the pill all the time and made them constantly in this state. They're more likely to be abused in future relationships. If you have another child that maybe hasn't been given the pill because their parent didn't agree with it, it actually leaves the person who was given the pill constantly very, very vulnerable, because all that they know is a controlling relationship. They think that's how their life should be. And the problem is, again, it's setting a norm for them that could actually be really harmful in later life. So to move on to my main point about relationships. So we want to look at the two types of relationships that we can kind of divide parent-child relationship into. So if we look at positive parent-child relationships where the family is very close, and again, this is not going to be a huge group that's affected, but I want to show you how it's still going to negatively impact them and could actually create more negative relationships. So your child's normal, happy going along, ends up having a bad relationship at school, but doesn't talk about it first. Parent, out of desperation because they're busy or because they simply just don't feel like dealing with it themselves, even if the relationship is positive, out of desperation, they could act out and give the child this pill. Even if it's only once, that foundation of trust that child has with the parent is lost. That child feels like they cannot talk to their parent, that feels like, even if it's only done once, in those formative years, say again, before you're 18, constantly that relationship, that one moment could affect your relationship for the rest of those years. The problem is that they lose their trust. So even if the pill's used only once, pill wears off, the child is going to be more likely to act out because they've lost that trust. They feel like they don't have someone supporting them. They feel like they have someone who's simply tolerating them. The problem is, so then they act out more. Even if the pill again isn't used after that, there's still going to be that loss of foundation. But the thing is, again, if they do become more likely to act out, that negative relationship could get worse, and the parent again could keep using the tablet. This thing then allows for a dependency. And what happens is the parent may become dependent on it, even if it's in desperation, becomes dependent on this pill, when again, it could actually be a mental health issue that's developing that isn't being addressed. The thing is, then no one ever sees this child's bad side, supposedly, and it's never addressed. Again, it allows for a cycle of effectively silence within the relationship. So let's look at the other type of parental relationships we have here, so the negative ones. So ones where you have a lazy parent or a parent's abusive. So if you have an abuse of the pill to like placate the child, especially in like larger families, again, it becomes a norm. As I said previously, it becomes a normality for you to have be in a controlling relationship. It becomes a normality for you in later life if there's someone that's really trying to control you and is telling you how you should be acting and how your mood should be, and oh, you should be happy. The problem is that again, it's setting a norm. Should they slip into some sort of mental health issue such as depression, and they feel sad and they feel like they can't talk to people normally, by having that pill there, it's become a norm for them that they feel like someone's telling them you have to act this way. Again, it kind of defeats the point of uniqueness. What happens is people lose their automatic uniqueness and their creativity because, again, they feel like they should be constantly controlled and constantly just, abiding by the law and following along. The impact this has is the child develops a negative relationship with authority because evidently they're constantly thinking, oh, authority is very controlling. And again, even if it's that we have a child that's not being given the tablet, if they see that there's like one of their best friends is constantly on it, they're in fear. They're going to be in fear that their parent might use it on them one day. Even if their parent, again, brilliant relationship, and they completely trust them and say to their child, I will never put you through that. The child is in a constant fear that they may be about to be just basically sidelined and shut up. So we see that we need to hold the parents accountable for raising their own child. We can't give them basically an out to basically just stop treating their child. As I said, rebellion is necessary. They're less likely to go all out and go mad at 18 and go on like a huge spree of doing loads of drugs and alcohol and defying the law. If they actually, do little sort of rebellions against the parents, sneak out once, do this, just do slight defiances, it allows the child to discover themselves and develop boundaries. Again, with which authority, it's necessary to have boundaries to ensure that you are not sort of introduced into a cycle of abuse. Thank you very much. And I've just proven to you how three of the relationships are going to be negatively affected under this motion, whereas there'll still be some bad relationships, but it will be more negatively impacted. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'm very happy to move on to the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hello, can I be heard? Wonderful. I'm just gonna fix my camera. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So I'll first talk about parents, then the parent-child relationship, and then I'll extend and explain why disagreement is actually far better on our side of the house. Firstly, on parents. So Leader of the Opposition says parents will become lazy, and this gives them an out to continue to becoming lazy parents. There are two things you should note when weighing this claim. The first is that it's already unclear why children should bear the consequences of the house they were born in, the kind of parents they have, when at the very least this pill gives them an ability to isolate themselves from that. Or even if you live in a not so good house, you are able to go to school and still focus on your work. You are not bothered by the likely exogenous circumstances around you. And therefore, with the goal of hopefully reforming parents, which is incredibly unclear on their side still, we would instead prefer a better educational outcome for the child, or the ability for them to not fall into drugs, to not follow the law, and them having a criminal record, which I'd argue is far better. But secondly, in fact, I'd argue the opposite is true, that the capacity to reform the parent is better on our side of the house. Because when you give a child this pill, you don't have an out, because they are already following you, they are already being obedient. A lot of the time what happens in opposition is parents blame their bad parenting on the character and conduct of their child. I have a problematic child. My kid was born this way. My kid is always so rude and disrespectful, and I have had no possible way in having potentially raised them better. Regardless of whether or not that is the case, this is the worst out for the parent, because instead of being able to reflect and examine where they could have possibly gone wrong, or where other people could have possibly called them out in bad parenting, you are instead able to blame your child. This is a particularly important mechanism I'd want you to note, because kids often don't have that ability to defend themselves quite yet. They don't have the connections a parent might have. They're not likely to be as believed because they're not an adult. And therefore, what parents say about themselves is far more likely to be powerful on their side of the house, or not their side of the house, with respect to the actual kind of kid that they have. The second thing I want to note about this, however, is that this extends to a lot of structural concerns. I'd note that a lot of structural deficiencies within education, within communities, is blamed on the individual conduct of children, i.e. we shouldn't fund Black communities in their schools because a lot of the time they have worse educational outcomes. They don't go to school anyway. They are not hardworking enough. A lot of the time, people are more likely to notice instances of women within schools acting out and saying that that's likely the conduct that they have, etc. All of these things prove that not only does it mean that it's better for them when they're able to work within the system, but also that political will and attention can no longer be diluted into saying it was the problem of the kids, that these kinds of groups of kids are actually the people at fault for the structural deficiencies in things like funding, and therefore is more likely to overturn educational outcomes for this group as well. The next thing I want to discuss is parent-child relationships. The first thing I want to say is that if this pill is used quite often by a lot of different parents, it's unclear to the point that parents already do a lot of things to be able to control our decisions, why this becomes a unique point in which you would cause distrust between the parent and the child. But secondly is you have to look at the alternative. Not only does this mean that parents could instead use guilt, use violence, use ways to be able to force their children to make decisions that are much more likely to be worse for their relationship, either because it creates like rifts between how they feel about each other emotionally, but also trauma physically. Because it is not certain that these other alternatives are not going to work, David points out that you are unable to attain the benefit, but I'd also note that you get more extreme with each additional punishment. Because if it didn't work when you restricted them from seeing their friends and they still tried it, maybe it is the time in which you start to restrict them and neglect them. Maybe it's a time in which you start to make them feel guilty about themselves and who they are as people. And in extreme cases, that escalates into violence because there was no other thing you could have possibly done. So all of these things, because you are forced to use harsher and harsher punishments, because as opposition says, you're likely to have rebellious instances as a child, it becomes worse because these relationships are then built on these kinds of punishments. And I'd want to note, secondly, that the comparative is that when these kids are using the pill, when they're more likely to be obedient, when they're more likely to talk to their parent, these could be potential healing moments in the relationship. Because when parents and children are talking to each other, rather than shouting at each other, rather than trying to punish each other in some certain way, it's much more likely you get to see each other's point of view. And therefore, whatever troubles you could have had in the relationship can now be more understood, and you can see what the other person is experiencing. Insofar as the environment for which you could have possibly put these issues together is much, much better for these children. So on all those levels, we'd already note that we are beating opening opposition for the same benefits they'd want to note. Is there a POI from CO? If not, I'll take opening opposition. CO? Okay, I'll take you now.
Okay, so I just want to quickly talking about, she said that, you can have a better conversation and heal your relationship in a better way. But surely actually it's just making the parent feel better. The child may actually be intimidated by their parents, doesn't want to defy them. Therefore, it's just a relationship of intimidation.
So this is the extension I want to talk about on disagreement. Because I want to be clear that this pill controls behavior, but not thought, not your beliefs, etc. And not only do I think that this allows you to do the same things opposition might do just in different methods, but I'd argue because, so for example, you can follow rules and still disagree with them. We do that all the time with the law. We think children are much more likely to, maybe they don't enjoy being at school, but understand its value and still want to be able to attend there as a consequence of this pill. Why is it then better for you to be able to voice your concerns on government? So as a child, I want to note you're highly dependent on authority figures and how receptive they are to your concerns because you have little ability to change them for yourselves. They're likely to have more power and control over you. What is the difficulty then on op in being able to voice these concerns? The first is reputation. Because a lot of kids who drop out of school, a lot of kids who don't listen to their teachers, do have very genuine and legitimate grievances against these institutions. But I'd want to note that on opposition, these kids are labeled as problematic kids. These kids are labeled as irrational. You shouldn't listen to them. In fact, it's so easy to say, how can you criticize the school system if you don't listen to your teacher, if you don't go to school? It's very difficult because at that point where you are known as a problem child, you cannot possibly engage in a dialogue where you say, I am going to school, but I don't think I am sufficiently learning enough. This does not cater to the kind of method by which I am learning. But secondly is the method by which you do it. Because all this pent up anger and the legitimate grievances you have are likely to lash out. So that's when you start cussing at your teachers. That's when you start using shouting or maybe go to social media rather than being able to talk to them face to face. And what all of this means is that on opposition, when you're unable to have a degree of politeness to be able to control the way in which you voice your very legitimate grievances and concerns, they're instead likely to be brushed off, put to the side, and be labeled as the concerns of a kid that never went to school and never was listened to in the first place. We'd argue that the ability to reform your relationship with your parents, the ability to reform things that are practiced within the school, is far better on government side of the house, insofar as the conditions for that negotiation are much better for children, and these children are viewed in a light in which they could actually have a legitimate voice about the school. Insofar as we prove, number one, not only do you improve the relationship and the outcomes for the child, but two, that if any troubles exist on opposition, they are better coursed through government, I think we cohesively win this debate.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'd like to move on to the deputy leader of the opposition here.
Hello, give me just a second. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The biggest problem with opening government is they fail to recognize what happens after you turn 18, right? So what if you control these kids? So what if you put them in school? They don't actually address the comparative of what actually happens. And this is what side opposition is here to say today. A couple of things in my first speech. So first, addressing the three preemptions that they make. They say that the coercion in the motion today is way better than the coercion that happens in the status quo. We say that nothing could be worse than the complete coercion, the complete control that a parent can assert on their children in the motion today, right? The good manners that you're forced to implement just makes sexual abuse by parents extremely easy. Any abuse by parents very easy. A clear deficiency in the opening government's case, right, is they only conceive kids as evil, right? They don't conceive the debate from other perspectives, from other actors too, right? They only perceive the moment through the lens of their parents. But when in reality, parents can be completely shit too, right? Panel should definitely take into account that parents are human beings too. Human beings have lots of flaws. They take out their stress. They can be drunk, whatever. All these things can manifest into a push and pull relationship, which is exactly the entire case of opening opposition, right? They take out this relationship with their children, and under this motion, these children have no avenues to retaliate, and they have to do nothing but stand by as they're being abused by their parents. Secondly, they bring you the point of normalizing behavior. Note that this is their only link to very many of their impacts, right? Their entire point is that, oh, if you're forced to go to school, right, then it becomes a habit, and you go to school in the future. We don't see how this is the case, right? People drop out of high school, drop out of college consistently, despite going through 6+ years of primary education consistently, right? This is what happens. It's because there are external factors that motivate you to drop out of college. Habit has no factor, and please know that this is a link to very many of their impacts, right, which cannot be sustained. So third, they talk about how adult knows what's up, and that's why kids should follow what adults say. We say that this is extremely dangerous, right? We think that society evolves and is actually motivated in large part by people from the ages of 1 to 18. What is socially acceptable changes drastically over time, right? For example, sexual orientation, gender expression. If this pill forces you to conform to society, we say this is extremely detrimental to your autonomy, to your dignity, to the evolution of society itself, right? And they bring up themselves on their first point of the point of time. They recognize the importance of autonomy of people's lives, but they somehow weigh the autonomy of these kids' impacts on their kids. We simply don't see how that is the case, right? Essentially, your little bits of autonomy, right? We recognize the fact that your autonomy as a kid under 18 is limited, right? But that little bit, this little space that you're allowed to operate within is what constitutes your personality. It's what basically creates your future, right? It's integral to your life, right? But if you force these people into conformity, you're essentially denying them any aspect of their personality before 18. You're denying them any avenue to express that, a little bit of frustration, the way in which you rebel. All of these are key integral parts to your personality. If you're the type of person to yell at your teacher, that's a part of your personality. If you're the type of person to run for student council, and that's how you express your concerns, that's also part of your personality, right? You think that the net harm to yourself as an individual by losing all aspects of dignity, autonomy, and expression, they far outweigh all the minor harms of you distracting some other kid at school, right? Because that amounts to basically a total, complete destruction of your personality, of you as a person before 18. They bring up the point, oh, it's hard to raise kids. Yes, we get it. The entire op case is about how it is hard to raise kids, but this difficulty, right, it's integral, right? No pain, no gain. This relationship, the push-pull relationship, is an integral part of your life, right? Well, just because it's easier, and moreover, right, just because it's easier to raise your kids in the present doesn't mean it's doesn't mean it has lasting effects for the kid when the kid goes past 18 years old. This is extremely clear. While it makes it easier to raise your kid, it is far outweigh the problems that will create for the kid as an adult when you fail to develop these relationships. When you were coerced to do something your entire life, you don't realize how you're supposed to combat authority. You don't understand the appropriate mechanisms in which you should address your concerns. And this brings you off as a poorly adjusted individual, right? You haven't been able to learn because you've never been able to, right? This is the primary concern, right? And just in order to weigh that, the worst case scenario of a terrible kid is limited, right? You have limited resources, you have no money, you have less exposure to evils of the world. And we compare that to the worst case scenario of you as a terribly adjusted account. If you have a job, you have almost unlimited resources, you can go anywhere, do anything, and the consequences are unimaginable. And onto their most compelling point, the point of structural disadvantages. But we don't buy that because the reason why people are structurally disadvantaged don't come from the kids themselves, right? They're basically doing a band-aid fix and they're pausing the problem. The real problem for these structural deficiencies that opening government mentions are the lack of resources, the lack of infrastructure, lack of funding, the lack of future opportunities because you're in a terrible neighborhood. There are no jobs. No one wants to be there. There are no jobs. There are ghettos. There's no housing, right? It doesn't matter if you go 18 and you went through school when you realize, wait a second, there's no options for me. There's no jobs. I'm not accepted by society. Society is generally racist. There's no housing. The place that I grew up in is being neglected by the rest of the world. So what you went to school? These problems still exist. So what if you're perceived as being easier to teach by teachers in school? That doesn't actually solve the underlying root problem that makes you lash out, that makes you have no choice but to turn to crime, violence. And this is the main point. This is the main and most detrimental factor to opening government speech, right? So now onto our substantive. Building on my partners, that this push and pull relationship is an essential part of navigating childhood, teenage years into the start of your adulthood, and it will last for the rest of your life, right? As my partner said, the relationship between a kid and a parent is the most significant and important relationship. Actually, before time up, can I take a POI? Closing.
Would you also be principally opposed to parents prescribing their children an SSRI antidepressant against their consent, even if this leads to better pro-social outcomes?
Generally, yes, that seems completely against a person's autonomy. Generally, I don't see why a kid would not want to take a pill that would help them, but it's completely different instances, right? Okay, now on to the importance of this relationship, right? How you interact with your parent is the basis of authority. Your parent is the primary authority figure, and it's probably by far the most significant relationship in your formative years and will last for the rest of your life, right? It's how you deal with people, how you deal with authority, how to deal with things you're frustrated with, how to deal with things you're happy with. This is extremely, extremely important, right? It's the basis of nearly everything. Relationships are the basis of the entire part of your life. We see that there are extremely significant effects of ignoring this. For example, right? We see that the parent-child relationship is very supportive, it's very healthy. Losing this is extremely significant. Secondly, if you fail to manage the relationships, that has far-reaching impacts when you're adult. You cannot integrate to the workforce correctly. What happens when your boss tells you to do something you don't want to? When your entire life you've just been forced to do it. You can't, no critical thinking, no way to issue your concerns to them. You're not able to be a well-adjusted adult. Finally, you're just going to do all the things you weren't able to do before, right? You're going to try all socially unacceptable behavior. You're going to seek drugs. You're going to ruin life. Only now you have the bandwidth of the adult, which is nearly unlimited. You can do whatever you want, and the consequences are far harsher. And finally, you're a poorly adjusted person. You've been a mind-fucked slave for the however past many years of your life. You could be violent. Someone has exerted their will upon you for the however many years of your life. You want revenge. You have extreme pent-up anger, and you've been controlled, and you want to exert this control on other people. Whether this means abusing your future kids or lashing on society, we say that ultimately all these consequences are far, far worse than just taking it and just being a decent parent and trying your best as a parent instead of doing the solution. Thank you. Please vote. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'm very happy to introduce the member of government here.
Great. Can I confirm I'm audible?
Yes.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. 2 claims from closing government in this debate. Firstly, more robust mechanisms than OG as to why we get better pro-social outcomes for children. And secondly, explaining the principled trade-off, why consent is less important than utility. Rebuttal to opening opposition. I have 3 broad claims. Firstly, they say this gives parents an out to parenting well. Our claim is that this makes it way easier to parent well. If you are a parent and have to deal with a depressed child who is also a truant, skipping school, but is also depressed, and you work a 9-to-5 job, this is probably very hard. When you are able to resolve one problem with a wave of a wand, that is, now they attend school perfectly for a certain interval of time, even if it is not permanent, you can probably probably deal with other issues in your child's life much better. You now have more free time to allocate attention to dealing with the child's other problems. You're now less stressed because you're dealing with fewer problems and more ability to provide socialization and opportunity to your child. Solving this time trade-off is probably much better for the kid. They then say bad parents will abuse this. OG should have modeled regulation as a part of this, but here are the mechanisms for why it likely will be regulated. Firstly, regulation of the use of this pill is super smart, and governments will likely want it to be regulated in the same manner as other medication. They can probably ban parents from bad track records from using it. That is, social services that take children away from parents who are abusive. Probably something similar happens here if parents are force feeding this to kids and making them their slaves. This means, oh, you probably won't be a slave. Secondly, presumably you have to get a prescription for this pill, which means there's some level of oversight on this in the medical field from children's pediatricians and so on and so forth, which means that there can be interventions at different points to stop parents from abusing this and turning their children into mind slaves. But thirdly, even if you give up their best ground and say there's no formal regulation of this, the social pressure from other extended family members and communities mean that high profile cases of abuse will mean call outs and an impetus on the part of governments to regulate this kind of thing, and this is good. Finally, the pill exists on either side of the house, as helpfully pointed out in motion clarifications. This means that only the people who don't want to parent their kids very well and have the means of capacity to get the pill are able to get the pill in opposition's world, which means the abuse potential is just much higher on op. Given that I've given you 4 structural reasons as to why the pill is likely to be regulated, when it is more well known, when it is more of a part of society, less social sanction and less political capital for regulation of the pill exists on opposition. So even if the pill can be really bad in some cases, those bad cases don't go away on opposition. Their final claim is that this could cost the trust of the parent and leading to the child spiraling out of control. 1, this is contingent on you believing mechanization that they never gave, which is that parents will be force feeding the kids this. We imagine this probably has to be framed in a manner that is beneficial to the child in order to get the child to take it willingly. In the same manner as you giving your child any kind of medication against their consent, like an antidepressant, you probably do have to have a conversation surrounding it. That is the dialogue and negotiation around the pill, e.g. the parent will tell them this will help you, and conceded this into my response to the POI when they said I don't know why a kid would choose not to take a pill that would help them. This implies that their mechanisms don't work in many instances because it requires you to win the trust of your child at least to some extent in order to get them to take it. We think this creates an opportunity for conversations even if they reject it and you have to force them on them. We think that's probably good. I'll explain why even if it does alienate the child from the parent in the worst instances in just a moment, we still get better outcomes for the child on our side of the house. Why do we get better pro-social outcomes even in the worst case where they emphatically reject the parent as a result of these kinds of things? The problem with OG's claims here is they reach for wide society-wide impacts of reforming education, solving racism, and so on, but they don't explain the instances in which this works to any degree of specificity. This is really important because O's challenge to OG is this is a one-time intervention that could lead to alienation and mistrust and doesn't solve underlying root problems like structural discrimination. And after you take the pill and you come to, you might have it even worse or feel alienated. What we're going to explain here, and this is critical, is why the opportunities the pill affords to you in the intervening time while you are on it creates access to social structures that set you up for success, even in instances where this has a negative effect on your child. There are 6 ways this happens. Firstly, the ability to give a pill to your child that makes them behave better acts as a social lubricant in school and in social situations that makes it easier for the child to make friends. This is because friendship in status quo often faces challenges due to a lack of emotional regulation that children have. You give children on our side a method by which they're able to avoid the alienation of these friendships falling to pieces as a result of that inability to emotionally regulate if the child is emotionally troubled, which means that the friendships this child has are more durable and last longer. This is critical because having friendships encourages pro-social behavior even after the pill wears off, which means they're less likely to opt out of the social structures. Friendships create networks that also lead you to be even more successful down the line because they push you to succeed, because they watch your back, because they are alternative support structures outside your parents you can go to even if your parents happen to be shitty or you happen to be mad at them for making you take the pill in the aftermath. This means you have people in your life who will step in and probably mitigate the worst harms of you feeling really mad about your parent forcing you to take the pill. Secondly, teachers, you get better relationships with them. When you act out less in class, they're more likely to do things like write you letters of recommendation or take you into their peer network and under their wing. When they believe you're the one good kid from a bad neighborhood, you increase the odds of these things happening exponentially, which gives you an alternate support mechanism, even if your home life is bad and your relationship with your parent is bad. Once the pill wears off and you're a little bit mad, the teacher can step in and make sure you don't fall through the cracks later on. You never give them that chance on their side of the house when they're acting out and the teacher doesn't have the impetus to get involved. Thirdly, your first job, when you consistently attend it as a youth, you build a relationship with your employer. This gives you access to alternative support structures, which is really helpful if your parents are just shit or you're mad at them. So even if O was right, and this causes tension in the parent-child relationship because you took the pill and they forced the pill against your consent, this now means you have more alternative mentors and authority figures in your life who are good people who support you, can give you things like job recommendations or a reference when you want to take out a loan and so on and so forth. Finally, in the worst cases, this is 4th mechanism. You can triage a depressive spiral or spiral criminality on the part of the child. What does that look like? Often when children act out severely, this can lead to them being unable to cope. If I'm a child who commits a petty crime like shoplifting, I'm more likely to do it again because of the social shame and stigma that arises or because I'm unable to emotionally regulate my response to doing a bad thing. This could lead me to doubling down on those actions and causing problems. This can be an intervention that triages that moment and gives you a chance to stem the bleeding potential of opportunities you could lose at the point at which you spiral into a life of crime or spiral into a depression. Fifthly, you get better socially utile outcomes in the situations where the marginal benefits of polite behavior are high. I might be a smart kid, but if I get distracted because I've crushed on someone in school and act out and get depressed and don't study for my SATs and get a poor score because I'm 12 and I'm a sad boy, this fixes that because now I realize the SAT is more important. I have to focus on those kind of things. The marginal benefits and outcomes are better. And when I study harder, I gain more access to the social structures and political capital that allows me to better attain my preferences, even if the parent-child relationship is bad. Finally, you just get better parenting, right? Why? Note that this is temporary, so you likely still have moments of acting out. You just limit them likely to the home. Why are these instances better and more valuable teachable moments? Firstly, because you can control when this acting out happens, i.e. when kids throw tantrums in public, it's often very hard to teach them because their behavior is just on the basis of their own feeling, but often compounded by other factors like who they are around and so on and so forth. You mitigate the harms that happen when this happens in public, when the parenting gets better. Before I go on, I'll take OO. I attempted to.
Under this motion, I don't see how you're just going to be this one good kid, right? Because under this motion, everyone's going to be the same. We don't see how teacher recommendations solve the problems of no jobs. Just like your entire point about how does it solve the underlying issues?
Not everybody has to take the pill at the same rate, so it's unclear that everybody's the same. That's an assertion. 2, it's probably regulated, which takes out a larger degree of that claim. 3, I think that you become that one good kid, or you have more of a chance to become that one good kid at the point at which you're afforded more social access to social structures. That happens on our side of the house. It's just finally the conclusion of that last point about parents is just parents parent much better. We think that that's quite good. What is the impact of all this? Note that OG is uncertain. It's uncertain you change social norms around discriminatory communities. What is certain is that the pill creates avenues and access to social structures around children that makes them far more likely to succeed. Finally, on the principle, and this responds to the claim about personality violations on OO. Why do we think parents have a right to do this? The reason we value consent is consent is a proxy by which the state or society delegates to individuals in order for them to access their conception of the good life. That is, society recognizes it is imperfect at approximating the preferences of people in many decisions, therefore delegates agency to people in order to make informed decisions. However, we are recognized socially by parents by virtue of the unique position of authority over children. Children having limited capability to make fully informed decisions, have unique rights to restrict the freedom of choice insofar as the decision could reasonably lead to the child being able to have a better life down the line. The intuition pump for this is that you can get a prescription for an SSRI to child on either side, even if the child does not consent into this. We think that parents, by contrast, are far better decision makers. And given that, insofar as you believe that consent or agency is important, we prove the reason we value it, that is, your ability to access your conception of the good life, leads to better outcomes. This happens better on our side. Very proud to win from CG.
Thank you for that speech. Now I'd like to welcome the member of opposition. Here.
Hello, am I audible? Right, I'll assume that I am audible. POI preference is through voice, preferably around the 5th minute mark, but I will also be indicating a time within my speech wherein I will be taking a POI. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I'm going to do is delineate. Opening exchange, recognize that children are vulnerable actors and are products of the structural systems of inequalities that are directly surrounding them. But the solution in government is to ultimately police the individual actions of these children, i.e. making sure that they go to school and disengage from destructive behavior without necessarily resolving the structural reasons why this is happening in the first place. Meanwhile, in opening opposition, they refuse to engage in the larger societal impacts that these vulnerable actors have by focusing on the internal dynamics of the family. While rebelliousness is a valid concern, there are larger structural reasons that are still existing and integrated within both sides of the house that have yet to be resolved. Like the first one, unequal access to quality education with teachers and classrooms that are well equipped to deal with a range of problems. Closing government tackled this, but not necessarily proving why it structurally changes. We think that they only act, for example, in terms of their capacity to trust this individual, but that trust is only at the surface level. I'll deal with that more on later. But the second is, there is a lack of stable families that are economically free and have enough mobility of access to resources with enough foundation for emotional and psychological support for the child. The third thing is the lack of, for example, safe and developed communities that are being valued and incorporated into the larger dynamics of the state, i.e. their political and economic concerns are given due recognition. We think that all of these things are still unresolved because the debate thus far has focused in terms of how we are able to police the individual child, right? In government, because even if you have access to the polite pill, there is no incentive to resolve all of these structural issues. We would also posit in closing opposition that we are able to resolve that even further because of the larger impacts that are going to operate when you implement these types of things. Note that this is an even bigger issue because the impacts of this emanate from the family unit into the larger community and structures of reforms, i.e. the incentive to ultimately reform the system. The strategy that we're going to take is opting out of the politeness pill is a necessary action because it is bad for the child due to the structural problems that remain unresolved. But secondly, we would posit that socially acceptable behavior ought to be naturally constructed and rationalized, and it's better if children willingly consented and developed as individuals as opposed to the imposition that is happening in government bench. But the first thing I want to do is respond in CG because I had a long list of like benefits, i.e. in terms of the social relationships, why it's going to be better in terms of friendship, in terms of their first job, in terms of the family. I would say that all of these things are necessarily not symmetric because these are things that can function within, for example, the fact that these families have different forms of incentives or we rationalize their current modes of existing. But the second thing is, we would also posit that it's more meaningful on our side when the teacher, for example, steps into your life and makes like changes in terms of how you ought to operate in status quo. We think that it's much more meaningful relationship in terms of the connection that is developed because it's not just imposed and based on the fact that you are being polite because of the imposition of a politeness pill. We think that because of the fact that individuals are much more willing to consent in terms of their decisions to change on our side as opposed to the imposition of these pill, which children can never consent to, we think that ultimately we take that engagement, right? All of their benefits are a wash. Extension then, how will this impact future citizens of the state? All argued that we will be more rebellious within the family and create resentment in the internal dynamics of that relationship, leading to all of the negative outcomes onto their individual selves. Why is this not enough? While we agree that this analysis is valuable, we don't think that they go far enough in explaining the impacts of the mechanisms of the politeness pill towards the individual and their relationship with the larger society. What we posit in closing opposition is the mechanism of the politeness pill can create temporary benefits in the same way that the drug operates. That means to say you get temporary highs and there is a resurgence, for example, of a need that ought to be implemented. Reasons why this is true, right? The wording of the motion assumes that the benefits of the pill can subside and can be temporary in nature. That means all of the benefits means to say that they need to be constantly applying these types of pill towards the children in the first place. And I just want to note as well that OG's model says that this affects their behavior, but not necessarily how they process and do these types of cognition, which is like how they recognize and intellectualize these types of actions. What does this do then, right? It creates an incentive for future behavior to be constantly policed through the implementation of these politeness pills. That means to say for you to get all of the outcomes that you wanted to have in the first place, you need to constantly take these types of pills for you to be able to be polite or take any of the individual benefits that they wanted to have. This is even more harmful considering that there is cognitive dissonance that happens in the eyes of the child because their behaviors do not necessarily match to their like way they process things, right? Because we recognize that children are more like questioning of like authorities, etc. This means that in government, you need to constantly utilize this mechanism to resolve all of the issues that are caused by the actions of the individual child, thereby creating dependence on these outcomes alone. What are the unique impacts that we bring to debate? Firstly, development for the child is unsustainable because for you to be able to reform all of these things that you've mentioned is ultimately dependent on how you constantly have access to this pill in the first place. I.e., if CJ wants to posit that all of your relationships are going to be beneficial, that means to say you need to constantly like be directly tied to this pill, thereby creating dependency as well. But the second thing is, future citizens become less able to mobilize because they did not have any formative experiences to ground their worldviews. There is less propensity for them to adapt to, for example, social movements because their childhood, for example, is directly constricted to the socially acceptable behavior that is molded by the family unit that is intrinsically limited, for example, in their scope and view. So if you live, for example, in Christian, like rural white Christian America, you're less likely to, for example, have any incentive for you to step out of that comfort zone, etc. But before I go to more impacts, POIOG.
If children disagree on either side, on our side, they're more likely to express that disagreement in more productive ways rather than lash out. The motion doesn't say they shut up forever, just that they'd stay polite.
Okay, I think that in that, for example, in terms of the capacity of the children to be able to react, I don't think that they have any capacity to react meaningfully in their childhood because of the fact that you can now impose this and they cannot even directly consent to this. But the second thing is, I don't think that in terms of how the conversations are going to create, it is not a polite thing to question authorities because of the fact that they, like the underlying assumption that you have is parents have an incentive to, for example, like act on the behalf of the children or like the utilitarian metric. So I don't think that meaningful conversations will happen on your side. But the third thing I want to point out is corporate interests are aligned with this dependency, thereby increasing the capacity of the children to, for example, distribute these towards these communities and create dependencies because that is the way they create profit. But lastly, like the state has more social control because children are generally more progressive in their relationship with these structures. That means they are less likely to, for example, counter all of the narratives that are existing in status quo and asking for moral reforms Ultimately, why is this important? Note that these are visceral impacts that affect the lives of millions of individuals who are going to be the next generation of voters. And if we are unable to give them a voice, let alone control of their individual lives due to what society perceives them to be, we're very proud to oppose this motion and grant them that freedom.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'm happy to move on to the government with you here.
Cool. Am I audible?
Mm-hmm.
Amazing. 1 second. The nuance OG doesn't touch is that the pill is temporary, but the implications of habits that these children build while they're taking the pill isn't. I think that's what's going to take us over them. I'm going to explain why we conclusively beat bench first before I go on to weighing. Responses to OO. They say that this is going to be a scapegoat for good parenting, and that's why it's problematic, that they're not going to have meaningful conversations with their children, and that's bad. The reason this is untrue is for a couple of reasons. I think first, Matt explains to you why there are social pressures. Like, people will judge you if you just use this as a reason to not properly parent your kid. Think about it, panel. People in the status quo judge families not because they use nannies, but in the instances where those nannies are replacements for those parents actively engaging with trying to get to know their children in the first place. I posit that this is somewhat analogous to this, where at the very least, if you do not believe any of the regulatory mechanisms, which Matt gives you several of, if you do not believe any of those, the social pressures that exist in the status quo are symmetric, to the extent that you might not be judged for using the pill, but you will be judged by your family, by parents of kids that your kid goes to school with, for using the pill as a mechanism to not engage with your child at all. I think that is problematic. But I also want to note an extremely important point, which is that the pill is temporary. So kids will still have moments of acting out. It just means that you're able to control when and where this happens. And the instances in which parents get to parent these instances of acting out probably happen in a much better and more meaningful interactions. Why are these interactions likely to be better or better teachable moments for these children? Because you can control when this acting out happens. I want to give you an illustration of this. And it's that when kids throw tantrums in public, it's harder to teach them in a way that one actually sticks, but also one that is emotionally and intellectually engaging for those children. And the reason this is the case is because when kids throw tantrums in public, in schools, in all of these areas, oftentimes these tantrums are lashing out, or their behavior isn't just an exemplification of their emotions or their thoughts. It's often compounded by the fact that they are in public, that they're in specific social settings that impact the way they express these emotions and thoughts in a way that's not actually good for them getting what they need. At the end of the day, they're impacted by who they're around. They're impacted by a need to look cool by challenging your parents. They're impacted by a need to not look like you want to admit your faults. All of these things means it's much harder to teach them, one, in a way that actually changes their behavior to good, but also but the second implication is that oftentimes the publicness or the areas in which lashing out happens leads to poor parenting that is traumatic for these children and detrimental to their growth. It's these instances where parents have to resolve to things like yelling or name calling, because the process of teaching your child is also the process of parents in these circumstances of trying to teach their child or curb their poor behavior is also compounded by the pressure of being in public. And so the way in which that parenting happens is often ineffective and traumatic. OO says kids lose trust in their parents. I want to note that probably by the age of 10 or 11, the kid knows that they're being given this pill. Parents probably have to sit down and have a conversation about why that is, in the same way your parents probably have to tell you why you need to take 5 vitamin pills with your breakfast every morning. But the pill is temporary, so plausibly you take it in the morning with breakfast, it lasts for the 8 to 10 hours you're away from home, and you come back. And what this means is you still have capacity to have those dinner time conversations for all the mechanisms we give to you about why parents likely want to be good, because naturally the human pressure to care for something you've given birth to, or some small creature you have the duty to care for, but also just social pressures, things like filial piety, that means you believe that being a good parent to your child means they'll take care of you in the future. All of these means, and compare all of these mechanisms to just saying, oh, not all parents are good parents. I think it's very clear why we weigh out on that impact alone. But note that what this means specifically is important, because Miko is correct when he says this pill regulates behavior but not thoughts. But the implication that they don't tell you in OG is this means kids will probably communicate these in these instances of having those dinner time conversations when they're back home and know that there's a safe space, and they'll probably communicate that in a way that's better. But I think the second reason that gets better is parents have more energy and time on our side to invest into having meaningful interactions with their kids. It's unclear to me why it's valuable for parents to try and parent and like curb these poor interactions every few hours if the way in which they're doing that isn't effective and isn't actually successful in curbing that bad behavior. In the status quo, the reason a lot of parents are less able to effectively curb poor behavior is because they are fatigued from constantly having to worry about how their child is behaving at school, from constantly having to worry about how this behavior impacts their future social outcomes. I think you alleviate some of the energy that is being put into that and give parents a better capacity to have meaningful and actually valuable, effective conversations with their children at dinner. The worst case, we explain why at the very least you position your kid away from problematic spirals. If parents are horrible, you allow kids to react to those bad domestic circumstances better because they are better at building meaningful connections outside of their house. But the last thing is this is more valuable than OG's assertion that kids deal with their circumstances better. We explain why you better capacitate kids to remove themselves from those circumstances in the first place. I think that is incredibly important. Going to CO then, they say stable families don't exist everywhere, and that's bad. It's unclear to me, first of all, why being a poor family necessarily means that you're going to be parents with poor intentions. I think that's incredibly rude to assume. But the second thing is, I think that there are structural problems that exist on either side. They'd rather shackle children to those circumstances and hope someone solves them. I'm sorry, but I don't think that's good enough. But the third thing that Matt gives you that I think is specifically valuable in this debate is you better create a social lubricant for these children to build connections outside of their house that are meaningful. And this means a couple of things, because CO asserts that someone is going to come into the lives of these kids and save them. It's unclear why that's the case and why, if it is the case, it hasn't happened so far. We explained that people outside these families for people outside families are unlikely to do this because poor behavior is often a turn off for people attempting to engage with you, but whether that's teachers, friends, or anyone else. But second, that people in the status quo preemptively don't engage with children from particular backgrounds because they're perceived as more likely to have poor behavior and to lash out in a way that is not fun to engage with. We tell you a couple of things. Two things. We explain why you maximize the likelihood of your child having good social and life outcomes. This goes much farther than OG. We tell you social outcomes get better because the friendships you make and the relationships you have with your teacher means that you're more likely to access things beyond that point, beyond the age of 18, when your formative years have taught you how to engage with your emotions in a way that's probably more meaningful, when things like being respectful, being kind, not interrupting individuals are things that are likely to be desirable traits in the workplace, when these are things that mean people are more likely to want to engage with you as an adult and prevent you from going into the spirals that make people unsuccessful in their life in the long run. I think that is incredibly valuable. When you don't have friends it's not just that you reduce the instances of children lashing out, you reduce the instances in which you create circumstances that are bad for children in their formative years. You don't have children bullying each other. You don't have children ostracizing each other to the same extent. These are all things that go far beyond the day-to-day interactions kids have with each other and impact the way they go on to live the rest of their lives. I think that is the most important consideration in this debate proposed.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'd like to move on to the opposition whip. Here.
Hello to all the contestants. Am I audible and visible?
Yes.
All right. For PU, I see it through voice since I will not be able to see the chat. But I definitely will try my best to still take a POI. Also, don't badger me. So I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Let's be clear with our strategy before I go on to the meat and potatoes of my speech. Firstly, we agree with the opening government. The debate about abuse and whatnot is likely to be symmetric and not easily solvable in this debate. The problem with the opening opposition is that they only deadlock the case by claiming that they make kids rebellious and hide abuse. But OG already proves why this happens on either side of the house. Given that OO has no clear comparative as to why they're able to make it better, it is likely that parents can also still force them to hide things like their injuries and etc. when they go to school, so they don't resolve the issue on their side. Therefore, what we do under closing opposition is that we don't deal with this. We focus on something else, which is targeting the value government wants to prove, which is making sure that children have a better life. The second thing that we do as a strategy is that we question the premises Gov relies on, e.g. the idea that kids will develop because of the pill and it will be accessible to the point that they will get all of their large-scale impacts. Closing opposition is the first team to point out these lapses. If you believe us at the end of my speech, government loses out in this debate since their bench is idealistic without tackling the roots of childhood development. We provide the comparative necessary for this and prove why our team is the only way to see this kind of development to begin with. 3 parts of my speech. Firstly, I want to deal quickly with the regulation point that came out from closing government, because they claim that regulation will likely exist. There will be things like prescriptions. I will be afforded towards these kinds of individuals. 3 responses. 1, if OG claims that the benefit of the pill only comes in large amounts of people being able to access it and being able to use this kind of pill in order to get the large-scale impacts that they wanted, this analysis for closing government cannot fly. They have to prove as to why OG's claim of more people benefited is less important. So if you want that kind of social impact that closing government wants to have as their own impact, it's marginal bet at best on closing government, and at worst it becomes a scapegoat for the state, which I think OO does rightfully respond to. But secondly, even if regulation might be necessary, right, it is the fact that states aren't always perfect. The fact that the opioid crisis happened in the US, where many people struggle from wrong prescriptions of opioid and etc. To the point at which the states, the doctors or whatever it is that is prescribing these kinds of things towards people ultimately are not able to be the most effective, and there's still the pharma industry that still has the incentive to advertise and coerce people to want to buy onto these kind of things. At most, the harm is still symmetric. It is likely worse under their side if you believe the harms of control over their own actions. But lastly, on the third response, the harm still exists because they also don't prove as to why they make the pill accessible. And it's an important thing with function, right? Because our case and the claim that came from a member of opposition is that dependency is important. And it's an important thing to note in this debate, because drugs can also change in expense based on structures that exist, like for instance, the pharma industry within Western states. So to a degree, you also make it harder for people to even access this kind of pill, to make the kinds of benefits that they want, such for instance, the large scale impacts. And you make it far worse for people when the point at which they cannot access these kinds of things, you make it far better for them. And you also make them more dependent on this bill in order to get all of their benefits. Next, we deal with closing government and their new impacts, which also has the same issues with opening government, which I'll point out later. First, they claim that you can choose when they act out. So you can choose when to give them the pill, the point at which they act out. 2 responses. 1, to an extent that you believe that you will use this as a scapegoat for them to be able to save time to lecture these individuals, they won't rely on teaching them these kinds of things and only using it in certain situations. They're likely to use this in most instances to make it a lot easier for them. This will be harder for them to be able to teach these kinds of students, these kinds of children, because you don't make them used to being scolded or told that these kinds of things are wrong. And my MO proves as well that these societal structures have an incentive to make you continue buying into these kinds of drugs to begin with. So you're not able to make sure that these people are going to use it in a controlled amount. But second response, you are also dependent on constantly doing this to ensure that they study and etc. Because if you want to get the social cohesion or the social lubricant that they want under their side, you have to make sure that these students are always focusing in class, are always being polite in order to get these kinds of benefits. Note that they still don't deny that they need the child to study. The worst of their models that the people who misbehave a lot will likely not develop. I'll prove this more later. Lastly, on their claim about access to social lubricant, like they can access social lubricant. 2 responses. 1, this is the same response with opening government that I'll prove later. If you cannot ensure that kids can carry this over to their adulthood, they likely would have less durable relationships regardless. They assume that you can handle it. The reality is that you change over time and can also affect your relationships, especially when you don't develop the proper psychological processes to be able to internalize your own emotions and etc. But secondly, even if teachers give you opportunities, you don't have the capacity to be able to handle this kind of higher education stuff because of the fact that you likely will still struggle to the point at which you're not able to develop the ability for you to be able to determine what is a good study habit, for instance, for you. And if this is about childhood, you have to prove as to why adults will be able to take this, because the point at which you're likely to look for opportunities or look for your teachers is oftentimes when you're an adult, when you likely aren't allowed to be able to take this pill anymore. Lastly, on opening government and why they cannot get the benefit of making sure kids develop. The main claim that OG tries to pose is that they make sure that kids are able to perform in school, do their work, and not be rebellious, which is also something that closing government does tackle, but at least they give new impacts. 3 responses. 1, this maybe happens in childhood, but it's unsure why this trickles down to your psyche. The OO response here is they claim that they need to rebel so that they can understand boundaries. Note that OO doesn't mechanize on how this manifests in the kid. They cannot claim the mechanism compared to us. We claim on our side. The point at which the pill is temporary, Gov has to prove why the effects last beyond that kind of temporary period as well. When you're under the influence, the brain is in a state and eventually will get flushed out, the point at which you eventually excreted the waste from your body. So you miss out on the experience needed and the ability for you to be able to rear your mind, to be able to better engage yourself into these kinds of habits and better engage yourself into studying to begin with, or understand why certain kinds of decisions are bad. But the second response is, at most, maybe you can have repetition under their side, and this is something that they prove as an analysis. But it's unsure as to why repetition can reinforce this. Kids can go through 12 years in school being taught taught to be religious, but you can drop this at the point of a hat, the point where they leave these kinds of schools. Gov has to prove as to why this seeps into your psyche. The reality is they are unaware how or why they did certain things. MO was clear. Making people dependent on the pill, like how some people become dependent on substances, for instance, makes it a lot harder for you to develop these kinds of things on your own without over-reliance. But before I move on to my last response, POI. OG.
Yeah, I think we were reasonably clear that the effects do extend beyond the duration of the pill, such as the development of habits, being able to be treated equally by other teachers, and just using this pill in general ways when you're having difficult times. This clearly is an example of when you can use it outside just the force.
Number one, what we're pointing out is you have to prove as to why the habits do develop. Number two, we also told you that the point at which, like, even if you maybe can get the approval of the teachers, I'm also going to prove as to why even if that exists in childhood, it's not going to carry over to adulthood. Lastly, on the comparative, even if they struggle in class, they first develop strategies on their own, on our side, based on their personality and etc., which carries over to their adulthood. So this is the clear comparative that exists in opposition bench. This is better because they're actively conscious and reflective when determining this, because their behavior is not under influence, but under their own conscious effort to think for themselves, and they understand their own meaning for why studies are important or why drugs can harm someone. CG talks about how we can talk to them on the dinner table, but again, they have to prove as to why they can internalizing it without experiencing these kinds of things firsthand and recognizing the action firsthand. If PM want to do weighing on scale of impact, then we at least have more future-ready citizens on our side compared to OG with good kids but unprepared adults. The weighing missing from OG is that, and it's the weighing that missing that OO, important if the debate's about the policies and where we get the better benefit. So the difference from us and OO and the personality claim is that at most it ties to their identity, but at most they prove that these kinds of things manifest in relationships. Proving that's why in your psyche it's able to better develop under our side compared to government bench. This is important because this rebuttal proves that their premise of development doesn't happen. It's worse when you have to grow up as an adult, when you have more responsibilities and they cannot easily deal with this because they weren't able to learn fully these kinds of things when they were a child. For all these reasons and more, oppose. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that speech.